This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of The Better Part by Synonomy, composed by Burning Aurora and Kailana. Sirius sat on the bed by Remus's side, waiting anxiously for him to come around. He had already done some preliminary healing of Remus's wounds. His post-moon medicine, an assortment of magical and muggle remedies they had refined over the years, was waiting on the bedside table, ready to take care of the rest. A hot bubble bath was drawn in the ensuite, keeping under a stasis charm. Harry was well occupied in his room with a few treats, bribes, Riley, and Celine. Well, Celine was fine too, resting in her crib. Sirius glanced over at her, heart fluttering. It was the first time he could remember not joining Remus for the moon, at least while he was technically able to. It was only in the pre-Padfoot days, when it would have meant literal death, that he had acquiesced to staying behind. The second he had mastered his animagus, he had been by Remus's side, and every month since then. Teenage arguments hadn't kept him away. Remus had been mad about Snivelus for weeks, demanded Sirius fuck off forever, but in the end had to settle for ignoring him when he kept showing up with the rest of the marauders anyway. The war hadn't kept him away. Despite the awful distance that had grown between them, both physical and not, Sirius had always found a way to be there. Even being heavily pregnant hadn't kept him away, despite the noise Remus had made about it. Because Sirius had always known, whatever else was going on, and whether or not Remus admitted it to himself, he desperately wanted Sirius there with him. The evidence of why was right in front of him. Judging by the wounds that littered Remus's body, the wolf hadn't taken the separation well. Sirius had found him passed out at the edge of the forest, in the protected spot they used to apparate. That Mooney had still thought to go there without Padfoot's guidance spoke to the bond their other selves shared. The wolf considered the dog its mate too. Being together helped keep him calm, keep him from hurting himself. Sirius knew it was stupid to feel guilty. They had both agreed this was the only possible way they could handle this particular moon. Celine couldn't be left with someone else, not this time. Still, his heart clenched as he looked over Remus's exhausted form. Thankfully, none of these new injuries seemed that serious. Sirius didn't know how Remus would handle another major scar at this stage in his life. He had a tendency to spiral, catastrophize. Get carried away, really? He gently brushed Remus's fringe away from his forehead. Remus's brow furrowed, and he stirred with a groan. Amber eyes blinked open slowly, drifting around the room before focusing on Sirius.
Pads.
Hey, Mooney.
Sirius said softly.
How you doing?
Remus surveyed himself, then grimaced.
What happened? I don't remember how I got here.
Found you passed out in our usual spot.
Remus's brow rose.
The wolf went there by itself.
Sirius smiled.
Homing instinct, I guess. Don't you remember anything?
Remus thought for a moment.
I remember feeling lost. Like something was missing. I think I ran a lot. Searching.
Sirius must have looked sad, because Remus said quickly.
No, it's okay. I'm okay. It was just, it had to be done.
His eyes suddenly widened, and he made to sit up, hissing as his sore muscles halted him.
Hey.
Sirius reprimanded.
Relax.
Celine.
Remus ground out.
Is she?
Sirius took a breath.
When the moon rose, she stayed a gummy, smelly human sprog.
Remus made an indiscernible noise, tilting his head back against the pillow. Sirius stayed quiet, letting him process.
This doesn't mean she won't be affected at all,
Remus said eventually.
She could still have wolfish characteristics. But,
he exhaled at the ceiling.
It's still good news, of course.
I don't know,
Sirius said mildly.
I'm a little disappointed, to be honest. I've never seen a baby wolf before. Bet it would have been cute.
Don't even joke.
I'm not. I mean, not entirely. Sure, this makes things easier for her, but you know I never thought it was the end of the world if she was a wolf.
Sirius scowled as he remembered.
Even with those ministry twats up our ass about it. I suppose we have to tell them she's not now.
You know we do.
Bet they won't even believe us. They'll probably try and take her again.
Sirius resisted the urge to spit on the floor.
They can get fucked.
Remus was still staring at the ceiling. He didn't look happy, not like Sirius thought he would.
Mooney,
Sirius ventured quietly.
are you maybe a bit disappointed, too?
Remus's reaction was delayed, but sharp.
What?
It's okay if you are.
Sirius said quickly.
You know, she's your kid. It's natural that a part of you would want.
How could you possibly think that after everything?
Remus stuttered, shaking his head.
How can you even ask me that?
Okay, fucking hell, forget it.
Sirius huffed. He reached for the tray on the bedside table.
Here, take your medicine.
Remus swallowed and inhaled and submitted to everything Sirius presented him with, stealing glances at his face that Sirius pretended not to notice.
Better?
Sirius asked, restopping the last potion bottle. Remus nodded.
Thank you.
There's a bath waiting for you too. Let's get you up.
He pulled the covers from Remus, then stood expectantly. Remus looked for a moment like he might protest, but he cautiously sat up and swung his feet around onto the floor. Sirius slid an arm behind his back, counting down before he pulled him to his feet. They moved at a snail's pace towards the bathroom. Remus was clearly reluctant to put any real weight on him. Which was ridiculous, since they had done this countless times before, and even with the height difference Sirius had a good couple of stone on him. Probably way more than that now, he thought bitterly, with the baby weight. Oh.
Cut it out, Mooney,
Sirius said sternly.
It's been a month. I'm not going to break. Lean on me properly or I'll dump your skinny ass on the floor.
Remus let out an amused breath. He obediently put more weight on Sirius, and their pace quickened.
You've certainly been acting more like your old self recently.
Have I, now?
Caught you dancing in the kitchen a couple of days ago.
What? When? I didn't see you.
I didn't come in, I just watched.
Sirius swatted Remus's chest, gently, with his free hand.
What? Lurking in the hallway? Creep.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Remus defended.
You looked so lost in it.
Starman came on the radio.
Sirius remembered.
Can't not dance to that. Especially when you're doing the washing. Fucking boring otherwise.
In the bathroom, he made sure Remus could stand unaided before wrestling his shirt up over his head, standing on tiptoes to get it off.
I'd say you should have let me do the washing, but then I wouldn't have been treated to your brilliant performance,
Remus said after his smiling face reappeared, hazel hair frizzy with static. Sirius grinned.
You were resting. Or at least I thought you were, creep. But it's fine, I can wash a few baby grows. Like you said, I'm not so much of an invalid anymore.
I don't believe that's what I said,
Remus said, mock thoughtful.
You were never an invalid, love. You're always so hard on yourself. Your body went through, essentially, a trauma. Of course it will take a while to bounce back. But you're getting there, better every day.
Sirius hummed, undoing the drawstring of Remus's joggers.
So my dancing was just as good as it used to be. When we used to sneak out to those muggle clubs.
I was just as captivated,
Remus replied, which was avoiding the bloody question, but Sirius didn't call him on it.
Certainly equally inclined to drag you off to the toilets for a sleazy liaison.
Sirius snorted.
Even with all the extra weight you'd have to drag.
Absolutely.
Remus said it so seriously Sirius looked up at him.
I almost did whisk you away. Not to the toilet, that seemed a little silly now we have a bed of our own. I had to have a very stern conversation with myself in order to resist.
Sirius swallowed, suddenly a little nervous.
You were just moon drunk.
Remus shook his head, golden eyes steady on Sirius's face.
You're just perpetually stunning, moon or no.
Cheers,
Sirius said, a beat too late. He turned his attention back to the drawstring, faltering at the realization he was fumbling extremely close to Remus's crotch, but he managed to get it undone. Remus shrugged the joggers easily from his hips. Sirius hadn't bothered spelling underwear onto him, since he had just wanted to get him dressed and back home as quickly as he could. He found himself staring stupidly at Remus's cock, soft and pink in a neat nest of dark brown curls. It still surprised Sirius how big it was even in this state. He had made many a juvenile joke about growers and showers in his time, and how Remus was such a lucky bastard to be both. Thankfully, by the time Sirius realized what he was doing, Remus had turned to the bath. Sirius lifted the stasis charm for him, and steam immediately began to fill the small bathroom, quickly making it feel muggy and claustrophobic. He tried to measure his breathing, and not touch or look at Remus's naked body any more than he had to as he helped him into the tub. It seemed risky now, somehow. Like it might lead to something he wasn't ready to think about or deal with just yet. But it was lurking there, that something. Like a memory waiting to be recalled. When Remus sunk down so he was up to his shoulders in bubbles, they both let out a relieved sigh.
All right,
Sirius asked.
Feels good.
Remus's eyes were closed, head tilted back against the tub. His face was already shiny with the heat, sweat starting to bead on his neck, clinging to the prominent bulge of his long, exposed throat. Grumbles sounded from the bedroom, a sure sign there would soon be an awful lot of noise unless the needs of the little person making them were swiftly met. Grateful for an excuse to leave the bathroom, Sirius left Remus to soak and went to Celine's crib. Her fussing quieted when he came into view, but her face remained scrunched up in displeasure.
Hey now.
Sirius soothed as he lifted her from the crib.
What's up? Got a smelly present for me?
He sniffed her cautiously, but only registered that clean and comforting baby scent.
No. Just missed me, then.
In response, Celine spit up on his t-shirt. Sirius sighed.
I'm choosing to take that as a yes.
With a fond salute to the shirt, Depeche Mode, one of his favorites, but it was his own fault for wearing it, he used the hem to wipe the mess from Celine's mouth, then laid her on the bed so he could change. She was still a little frowny, but her eyes didn't light up when Sirius's shirt came off, so she wasn't hungry either. He saw her legs were kicking restlessly, her hands clenching into tiny fists, and hummed with understanding. He brought her down to the living room, bouncing her gently against his chest as he took slow laps around the sofa. Sometimes she just got antsy in her crib and wanted to be walked around. Sirius could understand that. It must have been really dull, being a baby. He talked to her while they walked, everything and nothing, rambling about the things around them.
See that pebble? It's from the shore of the school lake. James tried to chuck it at my head one day, but it missed and hit your dad instead. So much for Star Chaser, right? Guess he was just better at catching than throwing, heh? Anyway, your dad found it in his pocket, like, years later. Funny how little things like that come back to you, isn't it?
They stopped in front of the fireplace. Sirius pointed at one of the pictures on the mantel.
That's James, there. You're named after his mum, you know. My mum too, really. He was your big brother's dad. Guess that kinda makes him your stepdad. Third dad. Uncle. Cousin. Fuck, I don't know.
Celine blew an impressive spit bubble. Sirius cackled.
I know, who gives a shit, right? Family trees were never my thing. Especially all those overlapping branches. Fucking gross. By the way, don't tell your dad I swear in front of you. He's convinced you can understand it already. Though I suppose if you can understand me now, he would be right. So let's not tell him that, either. I already get enough grief for slipping up around Harry.
Celine made a burbling sound, still gazing at the mantel.
Thanks. You know, and don't tell your dad I said this, either. It really wouldn't have been the end of the world, if you were a little pup. Could have been a little pack, couldn't we? Although, I wouldn't have liked your brother being left behind. Suppose I could have taught him the anime guy when he got a bit older. Just imagine if he was a stag, too. God, James would be so proud. Doubt your dad would approve, though.
Sirius jumped as the door slammed, but it was only Harry zooming into the room on his miniature clean sweep. He followed in Sirius's footsteps by lapping the sofa, taking the sharp turns with remarkable ease for a kid his age. Sirius was too awed to reprimand him right away.
Padfoot.
Harry bellowed as he whizzed past.
Look what I can do. Watch me.
I'm watching.
Sirius assured him.
Very good, Sprog. You're getting better all the time. You know the rules, though. Outside, okay.
Harry didn't respond as quickly as Sirius would like, stealing another lap before coming to hover in the middle of the room.
Down,
Sirius said firmly. Harry pouted, but he dismounted onto the rug.
Will you watch me outside, then?
Not right now. Your sister's being a bit fussy. Later though, yeah.
Harry threw his broom on the floor, startling Sirius.
She's always fussy. You're always busy with her now. You never play with me anymore.
That's not true.
Sirius said, stricken.
Is it?
Harry nodded crossly, folding his arms.
Yesterday, I wanted to play snakes and ladders. But Minnie said he was ill again and you were too busy and I had to go to bed early. It was a horrible day. And now you made me stay in my room and I'm bored.
Harry's face was red at the end of his rant. Sirius realized this had probably been building for a while. Guilt settled in his chest. While they had always made sure Harry was taken care of, it was true he hadn't been their highest priority recently. It was perhaps forgivable in those first couple of weeks, when everything was so chaotic and stressful, and they hadn't had energy left at the end of the day for anything other than crawling into bed and passing out, stealing what precious hours of rest they could before Celine needed to be fed again. Their attention was finite then, and the idea they could spare any for something like a board game just wasn't realistic. But things weren't so hectic now. They had Celine settled in a routine, and they were settling into their new normal too. If Sirius was being honest with himself, he could have dedicated more time to Harry. He wasn't sure why he hadn't, other than it was hard to transition back from that obsessive and protective state of mind those early days had put him in. But now he was determined he would. With the werewolf question finally put to bed, there was even less justification to stay stuck.
You're right.
Sirius admitted.
Your sister takes a lot of our time, but we still should have made some for you. I'm sorry, Harry. Things will be different from now on.
Harry peered up at him suspiciously.
Really? Do you promise?
Sirius crouched down so they were eye level with each other.
I promise. And Mooney promises, too. Why don't we take your broom outside, and you can show me and Celine how good you've gotten.
Harry immediately brightened, snatching up his broom from the floor.
Okay.
It was a nice day outside. The wind was low, and the sun was bright where it peeked out from between white, fluffy clouds. The worst of the summer heat had passed, but it wasn't yet cold enough to suggest autumn was near. Perfect weather for flying. Harry bolted down the garden, leaving Sirius to perch on the little wall that separated the lawn and the paving around the back door. The grass was comically overgrown, knee-length and scattered with thistles and dandelions, except for the trampled path Harry had made by frequently venturing out there. Another thing that had been neglected in Celine's wake, Sirius thought. He was almost positive it was infested with gnomes. He resolved to deal with that soon, too.
See this?
He plucked an eared stem of grass and tickled Celine's chin with it.
This is your fault.
Celine grasped at the air until she managed to close her fingers around the stem. She didn't look particularly ashamed of herself.
Padfoot.
Harry yelled.
Are you watching? Is Celine watching?
Sirius did indeed watch, still awed, as Harry zoomed around the garden. He encouraged Celine to look too. She needed influences other than the stuffy academia Remus would bombard her with, but she seemed more interested in the grass. Come to think of it, Sirius thought he remembered Remus telling him that baby Celine's age could only see about a foot in front of their face. He wasn't about to tell Harry that, though. When he flew over for feedback, he beamed when Sirius told him that Celine had clearly been very impressed.
I'll teach her when she's bigger,
Harry declared.
but she won't be as good as me.
Sirius laughed, hopelessly reminded of James. He wondered if Celine would ever do that for him, or Remus. If she would ever evoke them so well, someone who knew them would be forced to double take. It was a nice thought.
You're doing great, kiddo. Will you be all right for a bit now, while I go and check on Mooney?
Harry nodded, already preparing to fly off again. That he was so easily satisfied only had Sirius more contrite, more determined things would be different. He headed back up to the bathroom, careful to open the door quietly. He wasn't surprised to find Remus asleep in the tub, arms hanging limply over the sides, slumped down in the dwindling bubbles. His face was relaxed and peaceful, a rare sight so soon after the moon. Sirius watched him fondly, until a noise from Celine made him stir.
Hey,
Sirius said preemptively.
how you feeling now?
Better.
The water sloshed as Remus pushed himself upright, rubbing his palms over his face. He smiled when he saw Celine.
Oh hi, you.
Celine gurgled back at him, drooling down her chin. Remus made a sound of acknowledgement, as though she had said something interesting.
How's she doing?
Yeah, fine. Little fussy, but fine. Just been walking her around.
And Harry, I thought I heard a tantrum.
Nah. He was upset because we haven't been paying enough attention to him lately. Which, I couldn't really argue with that, because it's true, isn't it? I mean, yeah, we've been busy with Celine, but things have calmed down recently. It's not like I couldn't have spared 10 minutes for the kid.
Remus hummed, frowning.
Yes, I suppose we have been rather caught up in her. Past the point of pure necessity, I mean.
Right. So it was a well-deserved telling off, not a tantrum. I promised him we'd make more of an effort.
Remus nodded.
And was he reassured?
He was after I watched him fly for a bit. You know, he's getting really good. For a 5-year-old, his level of control is mental.
A natural.
Remus said softly.
Unsurprising.
Sirius smiled.
Yeah.
Remus still looked thoughtful.
Maybe we should tell him about me. I know we said we would wait until he was a little older, but I don't know. He's already starting to notice I'm mysteriously ill every month, and honestly, I'm not sure he believes it's real. He wanted me to play something with him yesterday, and when I said I wasn't up to it, he acted like I was using it as an excuse. Apparently 5 is the age the sarcasm muscle develops.
I mean, he could have just been acting pissy because of this.
Sirius reasoned.
But it's up to you.
Well, I worry about rumors, too. You know, it's not exactly a secret in certain circles, as the lovely Mr. Bogart demonstrated.
Remus's lip curled briefly.
And I'd rather he heard it from me.
I get it. I agree. Don't want some twat filling his head with bigoted bullshit.
Remus raised an eyebrow, looking significantly at Celine. Sirius rolled his eyes.
Oh, shut up. She's not even listening. Look, you've bored her to sleep.
Put her down, then, and help me out of this tub.
Remus snipped. Later in the evening, after Harry was in bed, Celine was in her crib and they were settling down themselves. Remus put his book aside and said,
You were right earlier.
Sirius grunted questioningly. He was lying on his back, dozing while he waited for Remus to turn off his light.
When you asked if I was disappointed.
It took Sirius a moment to remember what Remus was talking about. He turned onto his side, squinting up at his face. He looked troubled.
It's okay.
Sirius repeated.
It's natural to want your kid to be like you.
But I don't.
Remus said.
I don't want her to share my hardships. I don't want her to have to deal with the pain, and the stigma, and every other awful thing about it. That's exactly why I was so hesitant to procreate in the first place.
He sighed.
And yet now we know for sure that she won't have to. A part of me is regretful. Why?
Because you're human, Mooney.
Sirius said, yawning.
And humans like being with other people like them. People who relate and understand and shit. Kinship, right? Pack.
Pack.
Remus repeated, quiet. Sirius slid an arm out from under the duvet, searching for Remus's hand so he could link their fingers together.
You've never met another werewolf like you.
I've met plenty.
Remus said darkly.
Too many.
Not one like you.
Sirius stressed.
Not someone who's a normal fucking person otherwise. Only ones on the fringe. Assholes who help keep the stigma alive, basically.
That's rather reductive, Sirius. Not all of them were assholes. They just weren't lucky enough to have the opportunities I've had.
Whatever. You've never met another wolf you could relate to, is my point. 'Cause you're such a trailblazer. Which is cool, but it's also lonely. It's perfectly understandable you'd want that connection with your daughter.
Remus was quiet for a while, and Sirius started to drift off again. Remus's voice only vaguely registered to him when it returned, low, caressing his ears.
I'm never lonely with you. I don't need you to share my curse to feel connected to you. Or Celine, or Harry. We're a pack, regardless.
Sirius might have said something, made an agreeing noise. He felt Remus squeeze his hand, the mattress shifting, a kiss pressed to his head. Then his eyelids were darker, and the dark stretched, and he knew nothing for a few hours, other than he was warm and safe and loved. It wasn't pleasant to be pulled from, but at least it was Remus doing it.
Love.
Sirius blinked blearily.
Hmm.
In the gloom of the bedroom, the figure of Remus faded into view, lanky and lovely in only his boxer shorts, hair ruffled around his head. Sirius registered the crying before he saw Celine was cradled in his arms. He sluggishly pushed himself up against the headboard. Then he shoved the duvet down, flipped his baggy shirt up to his shoulders, and beckoned Remus to pass her over. His eyes had already closed again before he felt Celine's weight gently lowered onto his chest.
Got her.
Sirius grunted. By now, he could just about do this in his sleep. It was purely instinctual, the way Celine slotted into the crook of his arm and settled down to feed. The room was once again blissfully quiet. The mattress dipped, and the heat of Remus returned to Sirius's side, skin of his bare chest sticking to Sirius's arm. Sirius breathed deeply, relishing Remus's scent, thick in the warmth of the room. He smiled lazily as he felt fingers stroking through his hair, tucking it behind his ear. He could imagine Remus's face as he watched them, that soft and reverent expression. The pride in his amber eyes. The simmering of hunger he had seen in them earlier. Sirius tried not to dwell on that last one. It seemed inappropriate, considering what he was doing. But his sleepy mind didn't want to cooperate, stubbornly projecting the memory of Remus's eyes fixing upon him. The way they always did not long before they darkened with lust, as he watched Sirius lose himself to whatever pleasure Remus wanted to give him. Suddenly Remus's touches didn't feel so innocent anymore. As they traced the curve of Sirius's jaw and neck, his skin broke out in responsive goosebumps. He couldn't help himself. He thought about Remus touching him elsewhere, everywhere. If he hadn't pulled away from Remus's gaze in the bathroom, if he'd stripped him naked and then himself, where might it have led? Certainly nowhere wild or energetic, with Remus still sore from the moon, but surely he would have touched Sirius. Perhaps he would have backed him up against the sink, put his mouth against Sirius's neck and his hand between his legs. Maybe he would have coaxed Sirius into the tub with him. Sirius imagined leaning back against Remus's chest, cradled between his lean thighs, their bodies slippery against each other in the hot, sudsy water. He imagined watching Remus's long, clever fingers tracing the curves of his swollen pecs, teasing his stiff, sensitive nipples until they started to leak, and he would murmur in Sirius's ear how he loved it, how it was so hot, how Sirius didn't have to feel embarrassed or ashamed. And he would be rock hard against Sirius's arse, so Sirius would know he wasn't lying. He remembered how big Remus's soft cock had looked and a shiver ran through him, half arousal, half nerves. It was impossibly bigger when it was hard, so long and thick. He wondered if he could even handle it right now, with how raw and tender he still was. They hadn't had sex since a good couple of weeks before the birth, which made this the longest Sirius had ever gone without feeling Remus inside him, at least since they were mated. Maybe it would hurt now, aching that way it used to when they first started fucking. He imagined Remus making him take it anyway, holding Sirius down and pushing deep inside him, forcing him to open for it, forcing him to come on it. Remus wouldn't fill him until he did, Sirius thought, always the gentleman. Then Sirius would be stretched even further, stuck and squirming on the huge bulge of Remus's knot. Gums clamping down on his nipple made him gasp and flinch. He sat upright, hastily pulling Celine off him. Remus followed him, instantly alert.
What is it?
Sirius shook his head, pushing Celine at Remus. Remus took her hesitantly, patting her back to coax a burp from her. Thankfully she seemed satiated anyway, eyes already drooping with fatigue.
What's wrong?
Remus tried again.
I don't even know.
Sirius grit out.
Are you?
Remus tensed suddenly, nostrils flaring. A smile bled slowly onto his mouth.
Oh, I see.
Knowing Remus could smell he was turned on had heat flaring inside Sirius again. He was abruptly overwhelmed, as though the past few weeks of deprivation had been coiling quietly inside him like water rising against a floodgate, bursting through all at once. The metaphor was especially apt, as he realized his briefs were already damp with slick. His cock was hard too, throbbing like it had been neglected for hours. It almost felt like he was going into heat, except that wasn't supposed to happen while he was still nursing, according to Hera. Maybe there was something wrong with him.
Fuck.
Sirius breathed.
Do I smell like heat?
Remus ducked his face into the curve of Sirius's neck, inhaling deeply.
No.
Are you sure? I feel.
Remus scented him thoroughly. His voice was husky when he spoke.
You smell exceptionally good, but not like heat.
Maybe we should Hera.
Whatever for.
Sirius gestured to himself.
This isn't weird to you. Out of nowhere.
Nowhere,
Remus sounded doubtful.
Are you sure? There was nothing at all that may have prompted this.
Well, just your gorgeous eyes and how filthy they made me feel. Thoughts, I guess.
Remus pulled back to look at him, brow cocked.
What kind of thoughts?
You bloody well know what kind of thoughts,
Sirius said wryly.
Still doesn't explain why I was having them.
Why shouldn't you have them?
Remus challenged.
It's exactly what I said earlier, love. You're recovering, starting to feel like your old self.
Sirius let that assertion linger in his mind, absorbing the truth of it.
Here, let me put Celine to bed in the nursery.
Remus's smile darkened.
And then I'll take care of you.
Sirius shivered. Desire. He remembered it, welcomed it back like an old friend.
Yeah. Okay. Hurry up, then.
Remus chuckled. He eased himself up from the bed, awkward with holding Celine, and departed the room. Sirius immediately kicked the covers the rest of the way off, overheated already. He reached for his wand to cast a silencing charm, thinking ahead, then lit his bedside lamp. He wanted to see Remus properly, see the way their bodies looked together. After a moment of hesitation, he wriggled out of his shirt and underwear too, tossing them in the general direction of the wash basket. He spread out on his back, flushing at being exposed, riled by the weight of his cock against his belly and the caress of the air against the wetness between his legs. He considered feeling self-conscious about the loose skin that clung to his stomach, the fullness of his chest, but decided that was stupid. Remus had seen it all, seen him at his absolute worst, and was clearly still mad for him. Anticipation rose as he thought about Remus coming back to find him ready and waiting. He couldn't resist taking his cock in his palm, sucking a breath at how immediately good it felt. Even this had been beyond him the past few weeks. It was just more trouble than it was worth, requiring more time than he had to spare. He didn't know if it was the abstinence making him so sensitive or just the arousal overwhelming him, but orgasm coiled alarmingly fast as he stroked himself. He was on the verge of coming, muscles tensing, when...
Darting without me.
Fuck.
Sirius huffed, but he grinned.
Too right. Took your bloody time.
Remus was smiling too as he crawled back onto the bed. They met in a kiss of curved lips and giddiness, as though they were doing something disallowed and scandalous. Sirius was reminded of when they were teenagers, rutting as quietly as they could behind the curtains of their four-posters, or muffling their giggles as one of them dragged the other into a broom cupboard. It was probably a strange thing to remember now, with a war, a mating and 2 children under their belts. They weren't old by any objective definition of the word, but measuring purely in experience, Sirius often felt fucking ancient. It was invigorating to touch Remus, be touched by Remus, with all those years of precious familiarity in their fingertips, yet also a thrill, a sense of newness. They pulled apart at the same time, looking at each other with wild eyes.
Hi,
Sirius said after a beat, still grinning. Remus laughed softly, tilting their foreheads together.
Hi, you okay?
Bit nervous.
Sirius admitted.
You, never.
Remus cupped his face.
We don't have to do anything in particular, you know. We can do as much or as little as you like.
Sirius thought about it, waited. He knew what idea his body liked the most, but the practicality of it was still an unknown, and that was bothering him. One thing was absolutely certain, though. He wanted to feel pleasure at Remus's hands, and he wanted to bring pleasure to Remus in return. Really, that was everything he needed. There was no need to rush into anything, he reasoned. After all, they had all the time in the world.
I want to come.
He said, then cringed. He amended.
I want you to make me come.
Okay.
Remus said lowly.
And how would you like me to do that?
Fucking hell.
Sirius's mind was flooded with too many possibilities. He was rapidly losing his patience.
Surprise me.
The corner of Remus's mouth quirked.
All right.
They fell back into the kiss, sinking slowly to the mattress. Remus covered him, the way he always did, and Sirius sighed with something between relief and excitement as Remus's weight settled between his thighs. That space was entirely Remus's, he thought. That comfy, perfect point where their bodies flushed together, hot skin on skin, and Sirius could wrap his legs around Remus's waist and keep him there. Sometimes it wasn't even sexual. Just having Remus's slender, strong body on top of him, winding himself around him, made Sirius feel so anchored, so safe. But it most definitely was sexual now. Sirius sucked a breath as his cock was engulfed hotly between their stomachs. He could feel Remus's cock too, hard already, and wondered suddenly how long Remus had been wanting this. Had the moment in the bathroom been a revelation for him too, or had he been waiting longer, suppressing his desires until he started seeing signs that Sirius was ready? The idea made Sirius's heart swell, which only increased his urgency. He pressed his hips up, chasing the sensation of Remus's heavy cock pushing against his own. All traces of trepidation had vanished. He could have just this, as Remus said, as much or as little as he wanted. Remus pushed back, grinding them gently together, and the friction was so good Sirius could have cried with it. The fabric of Remus's underwear was sticking to the slick that was starting to pool between Sirius's legs, smearing it across his thighs. Why the hell was he even still wearing them? Sirius tried to push them off Remus's hips, but Remus took his wrist and pressed Sirius's hand to the bed beside them. Sirius started to protest, but then Remus ducked his head and there were lips on his chest, and he tensed too hard for words. Remus kissed a line down his sternum, lingering on the rune ink there, as his palms slid slowly up Sirius's stomach. They splayed over his ribs, bracketing the swells of heavier flesh but not quite cupping them, like he wasn't sure it was allowed. Sirius flushed furiously, torn between shying away and telling Remus to just play with his fucking tits already. He was snickering before he could stop himself. Remus lipped up, a bemused smile on his face.
What?
Sirius could only shake his head, stroking the curve of Remus's skull.
You're gorgeous when you laugh,
Remus told him.
Tell me if I do anything you don't like, okay, sweetheart.
He kissed his way over to a nipple, and Sirius's laughter abruptly died. Remus held his eyes as he touched the tip of his tongue to the hard nub, circling it slowly before closing his mouth around it.
Mooney.
Sirius grit out, face burning. Before the birth, having Remus's hot, wet, devious mouth on his nipples had been one of his favorite pastimes, but now it just seemed obscene, considering what their primary purpose had become. It looked obscene. Yet he couldn't look away. And it wasn't even close to the same sensation as feeding Celine. Sirius's body was thrumming with heat. When Remus sucked, it spiked sudden and sharp, pulling at something behind his navel. He felt a rush of slick soak the sheets as his hips kicked helplessly, wrenching a strangled sound from his throat. Remus's thumb toyed with his other nipple as his mouth worked, and then his large palm was engulfing the swell of flesh, squeezing gently, coaxing a droplet of milk to rise and dribble over his fingers. Sirius watched, wide-eyed, as Remus raised his fingers to his mouth, breathless with the utter filthiness of it. When Remus dipped back down to take it directly from his nipple, Sirius was gone, back arching in desperation to get closer as high, whining noises tumbled from his throat. Remus hummed back at him, low and rumbling. His eyes were dark, that way they got fixed on Sirius's face even as his mouth worked to drive him insane. It was too intense. Sirius couldn't look back anymore. His head tipped back, eyes squeezing shut. His fingers were clenching on the nape of Remus's neck, half encouraging, half just holding on. His writhing rutted his cock against Remus's chest, and the tight, damp slide of skin combined with the pleasure Remus was inflicting upon him had his orgasm rearing suddenly. But Remus pulled off before it could peak.
Fuck.
Sirius gasped.
No, come, don't stop.
Remus made a soothing noise. Then Sirius felt his weight shifting, sliding further down his body.
Not yet, love. Not like this. There's something else I've been dying to do to you.
Sirius panted, wound so tight he thought he might snap. He felt Remus's hot breath against his cock and moaned, but Remus didn't stop there. He ducked down further, and then his hands were sliding up the backs of Sirius's thighs, pushing his knees against his chest, spreading his legs wide.
Oh God.
Sirius choked as he realized what Remus wanted. Just the idea was...
You're so wet,
Remus murmured.
I've always loved that about you. You're always so responsive, so eager and ready for me. It's been far too long since I've tasted you.
Sirius couldn't even find words to respond. He pleaded with his body instead, bending willingly under Remus's hands, exposing himself gladly. He thought he would surely come the second Remus's tongue touched him, but he felt it on his inner thigh first, more teasing kisses, easing him into it. When Remus finally licked over his hole, dragging the flat of his tongue up from his tailbone, Sirius's whole body jerked, breath whistling through his teeth. God, he was insanely sensitive. It was almost too much, but Remus was so gentle with him, keeping his strokes broad and light, not trying to breach him. Despite knowing for certain he couldn't take it now, Sirius almost wanted him to anyway. Remus licked over him again and again, until Sirius was panting and whining, hole clenching desperately against Remus's tongue, so wet he could feel it coating Remus's entire lower face. He writhed helplessly, but Remus's hands were solid anchors on his thighs, holding his hips still, keeping his legs pushed back and open.
Fuck me, please just fuck me,
was a chant in Sirius's head, an almost moan on his tongue. He practically shouted when he could take it no longer, voice ringing out, cracking.
Remus, fuck. Please.
On the next pass, Remus's tongue dragged up over his balls and the length of his cock. While Sirius was reeling, Remus growled.
Yes, darling, precious boy, come for me.
And then the heat of his mouth was around Sirius's cock, taking him into the tight clutch of his throat. The orgasm was almost painful in its intensity, racking Sirius's whole body with shudders, fingers snagging in Remus's hair and thighs shaking around his ears. Remus wrung it out of him, swallowing around his cock until Sirius collapsed against the mattress. Only when he was whimpering from overstimulation did Remus release him. Sirius heaved, struggling to catch his breath. He could barely see, but he registered Remus looming over him, felt a kiss pressed to his mouth. He responded unthinkingly, lifting heavy arms to wrap around Remus's shoulders. His heart fluttered as he tasted himself on Remus's tongue.
Good,
Remus whispered against his lips. Sirius managed a scoff.
No. Terrible. Only pretended to lose my fucking mind.
Remus huffed a laugh, trailing more kisses down the side of Sirius's neck. When he reached the scar, Sirius instinctively bared his throat for him. He would have thought it impossible, but he felt another spark of arousal as Remus hummed with satisfaction. Remus's cock pressed against his hip, and Sirius was abruptly stricken, realizing he had yet to even touch him. He surged up, suddenly re-energized, urging Remus to roll over onto his back. He knew exactly what he wanted. He could still have Remus inside him. Remus's eyes were still so very dark as they watched Sirius pepper kisses over his torso, but he said,
You don't have to.
I'm aware, thanks, Mooney.
Sirius muttered.
I want to.
He dragged his mouth down to Remus's stomach, pressing a final lingering kiss to the outline of his cock where it was straining against his underwear. It twitched beneath the fabric. Remus's breath hitched. He lifted his hips when Sirius tucked his fingers under the waistband, bringing his legs up to let Sirius tug them down and off. His cock slapped back against his stomach, and Sirius took a moment to appreciate the stiff, straining length of it, thick and flushed and fucking huge. The knot was half grown already, and God, just the sight of it made Sirius wetter, whole clenching in longing. He wanted so desperately to straddle Remus's hips and take it inside himself. But the idea of having Remus in his mouth made him wet too, saliva already pooling on his tongue. He settled eagerly between Remus's legs, reacquainting himself, remembering the heady smell of him. He flattened his tongue against the base of Remus's cock, dragging upwards until it curved over the slick, swollen head. He remembered the taste too, musky and intoxicating. It was something like Remus's scent, but thicker and more concentrated, and hard-wired into his brain as meaning sex, pure, an animal. He smoothed his hands over Remus's stomach, wrapping one around the base of his cock, engulfing the bulge of his knot. Even without it fully formed, it was too thick for Sirius's fingers to meet, a fact that always sent a thrill of nerves through him. He took a deep breath before he opened his mouth around the head, sealing his lips and sinking down slowly. It took him a few tries before he could meet his fist. Then he lingered there, breathing heavily through his nose, hovering on the very edge of a gag, reveling in the feeling of being so full. He was joyous he had found a way to have that still. He felt Remus's belly trembling under his free hand and pulled off halfway so he could look up at him. His expression was pure lustful wonder, eyes fixed on Sirius's face, brow pulled tight, mouth slack. When their gaze met, a heavy breath escaped him. He reached out and slid his fingers into Sirius's hair, pushing it back from his face, pulling strands free that were sticking to the wetness smeared around his mouth.
Gorgeous,
he breathed.
Absolutely gorgeous. I love you.
Sirius flushed happily, holding Remus's eyes for as long as he could as he sunk back down. He settled into a languid rhythm, quickly losing himself to the mind-numbing wonderfulness of it, the way it diluted everything down to pure sensation. Remus's perfect scent, perfect taste, perfect sounds. He was everywhere, inside Sirius and around him, slowly coming apart under everything Sirius was making him feel. In no time at all Sirius felt the hand in his hair tighten, the hips under his mouth tense. But Remus didn't pull him or choke him. He made a low noise of warning, but Sirius doubled down, hollowing his cheeks, stroking and squeezing his hand around the swelling knot. Remus let out a ragged groan as he came, and Sirius mimicked what Remus had done to him, taking him in as far as he could and swallowing through every pulse. He made sure Remus was wrung out completely too, breaths catching on high notes, before he released him. Sirius sat up, grinning at the mess he had made of his mate. Remus was always so dignified, so composed, so to see him sprawled in a hopeless, sweaty daze, and know it was Sirius's doing, was intensely satisfying. Sirius had missed seeing it. Missed having this with him.
Good.
Remus laughed weakly.
And many other synonyms. Come here.
Sirius eagerly sunk into Remus's embrace. He had missed this even more than the sex, he thought. Not that they didn't still hold each other, but it was different like this. Naked, satiated, sticking together. Remus's scent thick and hot, Remus's heartbeats slowing under his ear. Remus, who knew him so well, loved him so well. Remus. His Mooney.
I love you too.
Sirius said, emotional all of a sudden.
And I want you to fuck me soon.
Remus exhaled, squeezing him tighter.
Yes, when you're ready, yes.
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora.